Hey, fifth grade. Today for our writing workshop lesson, we're going to be talking about the power of I. This is just a mini lesson, and it's something that I hope you'll pay attention to and apply to in your own writing. I'm going to go ahead and click on the slide presentation. This is just for the purpose of our video. If you watch this video, you don't need to go in and view the slides. It's just in case you want to refer back to it after this lesson has been taught. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I think you can already guess, based on the number of poems we've already read together, not to mention my embarrassing enthusiasm for all of them, how much I love poetry. More than any other genre, poetry helps me live my life. It connects me with others at the most essential level, one heart and mind touching another heart and mind. And it distances me too, invites me to see the familiar with fresh eyes. And poetry is the language of my feelings. It expresses my needs, my hopes, my dreams, my heartaches, and the sources of my happiness. Better than any other genre, poetry is useful to my life. I want it to be useful to yours too. So I begin with a warning. Good poetry, the useful kind, is often hard to write. It's easy to string together collections of pretty words and parcel them into lines and stanzas. What I'm talking about is the hard work of the good poet, figuring out what the feeling is, finding your truth, choosing and arranging, cutting and splicing, writing a riddle that contains its own answers. There's a myth about writing good poetry, that it's an exquisite experience that comes to a poet on the wings of a dove. Kind of like you see in the movies where the heavens open up and you hear, oh, and there's a ray of light that shines down. I think that's what people think sometimes, but it's not true. Good poets work at it. They know what a good poem does, is, and can do. I love these quotes by the poets Wesley McNair and Emily Dickinson. These good poets know labor. The first one is the capacity to revise determines the true writer. Suspect the finished poem. Your evil twin wants your poem to be finished. I love this one. And you guys can probably relate because, you did the pre-writing and then you wrote your draft. And by the time it was time to go in and revise, you were like, ah. So it's hard to go back in and be critical with ourselves. And sometimes it's hard to recognize what exactly our poem needs. But true revision reveals probably the true poem. And so going in and really digging in and rolling up those sleeves and being willing to cut and move things and add things and take another look, it truly does determine what the outcome is at the end. And this cracks me up because it says your evil twin wants your poem to be finished. We've all been there, haven't we? You've invested a lot of time into writing the poem and to gathering details, and you just want to be done with it, but it's just not quite there. Don't give in to that feeling. And then the second poem, if I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. And I love this one because I don't know what it feels like to have the top of my head taken off, but I do know what it's like when we're sitting in the classroom and we're reading about a poem that has a heavy content or a very difficult theme for us to get to. When I start seeing the light bulb go on, when I start seeing you guys say, oh, I get it now. Or when you guys bring up something that I hadn't noticed myself even, because the thing about poetry, one of the reasons that I love it so much is that it means different things to different people sometimes. And so you may see it one way and I may see it another, and we can both be right about it. But I love it. I love it when my students bring up a viewpoint or a perspective that I hadn't considered myself. It's always fun to take a second look at it, a poem that I've known and loved for a long time. So I could talk poetry all day. I think I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So how do you work at a poem and try to make it a good one? It is different. Sorry. Is it different from drafting and revising a memoir, an essay? In some important ways, yes. I have a handful of suggestions, 8 to be exact, of techniques for you to keep in mind when you draft and revise your free verse poems, as opposed to your narratives and exposition. Those are just other forms of writing that we will get to this year. Narratives are when you're telling the story, and exposition is when you're explaining something or arguing something. Um, the first one can be found on page 18 of your ELA reference folder. And I think it's important that we start with a definition of what free verse poetry is. Even though we've already been reading it and writing it, I think that having a solid understanding of that helps make helps us as writers make our writing, especially of free verse poems, better. Um, Free verse poetry is poetry that doesn't have a regular rhythm, line length, or rhyme scheme. It relies on the natural rhythms of speech. Today, it is the form of poetry that most American poets prefer. Free verse poetry invents and follows its own forms, patterns, and rules. And that's the thing that I love about it the most is that the writer just has so much control and so much say over the writing piece. So if free verse poets create and follow their own forms, how can there be rules? In fact, they're more like conventions or approaches that free verse poets and their readers have agreed in a general way that make poems stronger. So I know some of you were thinking, wait a minute, you just said you want us to do these things. You just also told us there were no rules about these things. They're not rules, they're just things that will make your poetry stronger and allow your reader to connect with the poem. So the first convention that we're going to refer to in our ELA reference folder is remember the power of I. So please read along with me. That's on page 18 also. Please read along with me the first draft of Wind, Seisa's first poem of 7th grade. Wind. The wind rustles the trees like it does the long grasses of the meadow, commands the water to move in ripples like tiny mountains, and rests at the sails of a small boat on its way home. Then the wind leaves to rustle other trees, blow through other meadows, move other tiny mountains, and send other small boats home. In a writing conference, Seisa was asked in the world of the poem, where are you at physically? Seisa answered, I'm sitting on the shore watching the sailboat. Then she was asked, how are you feeling? She answered, like I want to be on it, but also like I'm glad I'm home. Her teacher found this interesting because it wasn't the poem in the poem yet. She asked Seisa to see what happens if she puts herself in the poem in the next draft, because the reader has nowhere to be and no one to be with. She told her to start her next draft with the personal pronoun I and see where it takes her. Here's Seisa's third draft of Wind. Read along with me. I listen to the wind rustle through the trees, as it does the long grasses in the meadows. I watch as it commands the water to move in ripples, like tiny mountains, and rest in the sails of a small boat, pushing it home. Then the wind abandons the small boat to rustle other trees, blow through other meadows, command other tiny mountains to move, send other small boats home. As I watch night begin to settle, I wonder, will I ever find myself in the small boat, watching the same wind fly over the green landscape, longing for it to land in my sails and send me home? Can you see, hear, and feel the difference in this draft as opposed to the one we read before it? Just adding the personal pronoun I also brought in sensory details that she experienced because she was in the poem. And by doing that, she gave us someone to be with, and then we also got to experience what she was experiencing. Don't underestimate the power of I to ground a poem, to capture you in relation to the world of a poem, to provide the single most important detail that a reader craves: a human intelligence, a presence, a specific someone to be with. Think about the poems you've been loving. They wave their I flag. Those poets have voices. I know that the temptation for beginning poets is to hide. You can't help but be self conscious, to think, who am I to tell about my little feelings and experiences in a poem? But you are the only one who can tell your feelings, your observations, your ideas, your stories. Embrace them. Wave your I flag. Find your voice as a poet and give your readers someone to be with. Your poems will be stronger for it, and your readers will love you for it. Please refer to the Power of I notes in your ELA reference folder just below our definition of free verse poetry as you continue to write poetry. So we have this in our folder, we have this in our Google Classroom, because these lessons, you may not be ready for them. These definitions, you may not be ready for them. But when you are, I want them to be there for you. So don't forget that this is there, and refer back to it when you're not really sure where to take your poem, or when you're revising and you're not sure what's missing. Think about these things. Remember the power of I. First person experiences need a first person. Make sure your I is present and is thinking, feeling, seeing, acting. Give your readers someone to be with. Find your voice as a poet. Wave your I flag in your poetry. I hope that this makes sense. I hope it helps you guys move your poetry to a different place, and that it also helps you grow as writers, because that's why we're here. We're not here to be perfect. We're not here to get good grades. We're just here to grow in our experiences and to be able to show that growth. So if you guys have any questions, comments, or observations, feel free to reach out, message me, whatever. If you're in class and you're watching this because maybe you were behind or you were absent a day, then don't hesitate to raise your hand and let me know that you have a question, or that there's something that I can help you with. I love you guys. Can't wait to see you soon. Bye.